was another one. Oh, to my folks with children questions. I'll just go ahead and jump to the chase with that one. They're currently uh, recruiting participants under the age like 17 and under now for participation in the vaccine. So we don't know how well the vaccines work in children at this time. And we're going to go pretty slow to ensure the safety and efficacy of the vaccine in the children. So there are no additional pieces of information that are widely available that I can share with you today. But as that information becomes available, if you want to reach out or if you want to chat again, I'm happy to do that. But I think I don't want to leave you hanging. Like that's probably the short answer to this question. So for Sakithia and Kimberly, I'm sorry. Then I think let me also answer the question about when you get the vaccine, is it okay to take Tylenol beforehand? So it's been the recommendation of some of the physicians to hold off on it. If you know you're really like, sensitive to pain, sure, go ahead and take your Tylenol ahead of time. But if you can hold off to just kind of get a real sense of where you are at, after the vaccine, it would be ideal just because everybody's kind of reacting a little bit differently. And so if you can tolerate pain and just see how it goes, then wait till after you get the vaccine. And usually you'll start feeling, symptoms around 6 hours after the vaccine. So if you can hold off, great. But if you can't, if you know that your pain tolerance is not that high, it's okay to do it. It's not going to react in a bad way that the vaccine would not work if you took the Tylenol. So that's one thing for the Tylenol. Okay, do. I think everything else I should be able to get to, or I prepared for today. Herd immunity. Okay, so how many people need, this was Kelly, I think. How many people or what proportion of the population needs to get vaccinated in order for us to kind of quote unquote be okay, or get herd immunity? Currently, the figures from the NIH, and you hear Dr. Fauci kind of talking about this quite frequently, is somewhere in the area of about 75 to 80% of the population, the full American US population. I think the reality is at this point, probably if we get to 30 to 40%, I would be pretty impressed. There is a lot of hesitancy still around the vaccines. I get it. I understand that, the concerns. And so, and even in our own VCU health system, they are faculty or staff, in the hospital system had been surveyed to see how many people would be interested in taking the vaccine, and about 30% of them said that they'd be willing to take the vaccine. So I think that tracks on to kind of the larger population, and what we see in our own discussions on a community level. So that's where we would need to be kind of like at that herd immunity level. But I think the reality is that we're going to fall short. And we can talk about what that means, or strategies later. So I think that covers some of the big ones that won't slide in nicely to the rest of the presentation. And I'm going to share slides, but I'm going to share slides in the just in the typical. I'm going to need
yeah, I've got you. Hang on. Let's see. Where are you? Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to share it in like the typical editing version of PowerPoint. That way I can still see your beautiful faces, and I can keep an eye on the chat fairly easily, so that, when those questions come up, I should be able to see them pretty quickly. But, you're not going to get that full screen, you beautiful slide piece. So we're here to talk some vaccine stuff, and we'll talk a little bit about variants and whatnot, but we're going to go straight into the first question. What is an mRNA vaccine? These mRNA vaccines were the first ones that came out onto market through the FDA emergency use agreements. And basically, in the shortest terms possible, An mRNA vaccine is one type of vaccine technology that can be used to protect people from that SARS-CoV-2 virus. And the way it works is that it actually will take, and I guess I should see if I can, I'm just going to go straight to it. I've got a figure here. So it takes, once you get injected with the mRNA vaccine, it will inject this mRNA sequence that encodes the spike protein that's on the that has been seen as external to the mRNA virus. I'm sorry, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That little mRNA sequence is encapsulated by a lipid layer, so just a fat bubble. It's wrapped up in a fat bubble. And the reason why all these little mRNA pieces are wrapped up in fat bubbles is because that's what's going to get absorbed by your own cells. And there's a reason why we do this on our muscular area, is because it can absorb more quickly in your muscle cells rather than other cells that we have in our bodies. So we inject to the muscle cells for this purpose. And so what you're seeing in the step 2 part of this figure is that encapsulated mRNA getting absorbed by a muscle cell. And then it uses, and then it will be inserted into the nucleus of the cell. And it will use then the machinery of our own cells to translate that mRNA into the spike proteins that are known to latch on to our own cells. And so it uses our own cell machinery to generate those spike proteins. And those spike proteins are, they kind of burst out from the cell and are then in your own system. So once it's in your system, these little spike proteins, that's considered a foreign body by your immune system. And so your immune system knows something is weird here. There's something that I don't recognize and I need to take care of it. And so it'll use this thing called an antigen presenting cell to engulf those spike proteins that have been generated. And once it engulfs it, it puts a little tag on it, and that tag notifies the T helper cells in your own body to say, hey, I need you to come and attack something for me. I need you to do some business for me. And that's one way that your body then becomes trained to recognize this foreign body, the spike protein, and it engulfs it and it fights that one, that fights the spike protein. Additionally, though, it does another thing. Once that helper T cell kind of does the immediate business, there's also another set of cells called the B cells. Those B cells are the ones that make the antibodies against the spike protein. It's those antibodies that allow the immune system to have a memory, to remember that this is a foreign body, this is something that's not good for you, and I want you to remember it. And so that way, if you do get infected or you get in contact with the actual SARS-CoV-2 virus, your body is already trained up and prepared to fight the virus. And so I want to pause for a second, and just kind of also make the point that this is not the case that the vaccines are putting some sort of shell around you, some sort of like, I don't know, invisible bubble that causes you to not get infected by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. No, what happens with the vaccine is it's training your immune system to be aware of this, the SARS-CoV-2 virus as a foreign body. In particular, it's saying, I want you to acknowledge this spike protein as something that is not of us, and I want you to move quickly and fight it. And so what you're doing is you're building up efficiency so that you can move through and fight the virus quickly, get it out of your system so it doesn't cause severe illness. That's what you're doing here, is reducing your chance of getting severe illness and, and worst case scenario, potentially going to the hospital. I think sometimes it's the case that people kind of misunderstand, like, oh, if I get this vaccine, I'm kind of like thoroughly protected. I've got some sort of shield around me, and that's not the case. So let me pause for a second and see if there are questions. Okay. All right, so that's what a vaccine, that's how it works. That's how an mRNA vaccine works. And with that, I want to kind of also address a myth that's been going around, and that's that because everybody hears this mRNA vaccine and oh, mRNA is like DNA, and oh, I know DNA and mRNA go together, and therefore I think that this vaccine is going to change my DNA. That is not the case. If we remember from our back in the day high school biology, DNA begets to mRNA and mRNA becomes protein. What you're doing here is you're not even dealing with the DNA step. You're starting with mRNA and you're just using your cell's machinery to translate that mRNA into something that's the spike protein. So nothing is happening on the DNA level that will be changed because of using the mRNA vaccine. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. If you've heard that and you are needing the words to kind of address that in your own spaces. And the other question that's also come up is kind of how long does it stay in my body after it's been injected in me, this mRNA? And it moves pretty quick. So you have to understand that mRNA is very fragile, extremely fragile. Hold on one second, I got to chat. Is this the first time that mRNA has been used in mass vaccination? Yes. And I will get to talking a little bit more about this in a second. And why I think you should trust it, but I'm but one person, don't listen to me. So in terms of the mRNA in itself is extremely fragile. And I mean, like if you have it out in the world, it cannot survive for very long. My husband is a molecular geneticist. He works in a lab and he works with mRNA for other purposes. And the running joke is if you just look at mRNA for more than a second, it degrades and it's no longer viable. You can't do anything with it. And so that's why you've got to keep it frozen at highly cold temperatures. That's why the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines have to be so cold. The other reason why they need to be very cold is they don't have a whole lot of preservatives in them. The other materials that are in the vaccines are pretty basic. They're, like we said, the lipid bubble that goes around the mRNA. So it's a fat. You've also got some salts and you've got some sugar molecules. That's pretty much it. In terms of the other ingredients that's going around, I'll also refer to something called polyethylene glycol that has also been added to the lipid to maintain its integrity. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But those are kind of the basic ingredients to the mRNA vaccine. And so mRNA, once it's translated by your cell's machinery, it's no longer viable, is done, is gone. If it's not been translated by your cell's machinery, just by being in your body for too long, it won't survive. It will be degraded pretty quickly. It just cannot last outside of a cell for very long. So mRNA in of itself cannot last long. And generally the materials related to the vaccine can't last more than like about 2 days is what the initial clinical trials had been showing. It's about a 2-day period for which all that kind of like, once you get the vaccine and it be distributed in your body. So if, that's, the kind of basic piece of how long the general piece of the vaccine will last. Of course, you've made antibodies. And so hopefully those antibodies will last for a while. for several months and up to a year. So that brings me to a question that came up. Will it be required to take the vaccine on an annual basis, or will there be additional regulations related to the COVID-19 vaccine? At this time, it doesn't appear to be that, there'll be a requirement yet. That could change once, there's more data out there. We have a better handle on what's happening with the variants and whatnot. So I think it's a place where the opinion may change over time, but at this time, the general consensus is no, we're not making it no regulation around it in terms of like you have to take it in order to work. I know that some workplaces are considering whether or not to make that mandatory. But at this point, it hasn't been put into place by any major corporation yet. But there are conversations. But to date, no, mostly because there's just not enough data to say like, yeah, it's totally fine. You should totally do this. Questions, comments, concerns? Okay. All right. So one of the major questions about the COVID-19 vaccines, the mRNA vaccines that have gotten a lot of press recently, are whether or not there have been adverse events. Yes, there have been adverse events. I wouldn't be fair if I didn't say that there have been adverse events. There've been very few. I mean, relatively speaking, when you're talking about, in the case of Pfizer, which is what I've reported here, their initial results that they submitted to get the emergency use agreement was on 43,000 individuals, just a little bit over. And of those 43,000, you can see that you've got, just a few cases, probably less than 150, where you've had some kind of adverse reaction, and those have been listed here. The most, I guess, most frequent adverse reaction is some sort of hypersensitivity, allergic reaction, or anaphylactic reaction to the COVID-19 vaccines, with the 137 cases that have gotten kind of an adverse, anaphylactic reaction. And that's been consistent in outside of the case control or clinical trial setting. So on the whole, that is, where they are. And I think if you compare that against previous vaccines, they're on par with the rates of receiving adverse effects with other vaccines like, flu or polio or whatnot. So it's not any more, the rates of side effects are not higher for the mRNA vaccines compared to any of the previous vaccines that we've had out in the world. And then in terms of, is this the first, vaccine that's been used for mRNA vaccine that's been used for mass vaccination? Yep, it is. That's why everybody's freaking out. And so, I think, and that's a fair thing to do. That's a fair thing to feel, is, a bit freaked out when you've got something new on the market and you're going after so many people. You're doing a bit of a leap of faith. I also wanted to bring your attention to the current update for some of these vaccines. There is a system. It's called the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. This is run by the CDC. And every time you get a vaccine, like, when I got my vaccine, I was asked, like, if you feel any adverse effects, contact the VSafe, use the VSafe app, or go to the VAERS website and log your adverse side effect in. So that there's information. So when the time comes that if you would like to take the vaccine and you experience any side effects, like letting people know that you've experienced them helps to generate the data necessary for us to come to appropriate conclusions. So thank you in advance on behalf of public health and research for, sharing that information with us. But what we've seen so far is out of 1 million doses, 372 of them have led to non-serious reactions. So, headaches and fever and what have you. Obviously, for me, this is underreported. I know there's more than this, but, in terms of like hugely uh, severe reactions, their rate is about, between 3 and 5 anaphylactic reactions per 1 million. So, on the whole, we're looking pretty safe here. And in terms of the general protocol for receiving these vaccines at this time, you get the vaccine, you're asked to sit for about 15 minutes to see if you're getting any kind of anaphylactic reaction. You're asked even before you take the vaccine, have you had any allergic reactions to previous vaccines? Do you have any allergic reactions to things like shellfish? So in order to avoid getting, experiencing anaphylactic reactions. So there are a lot of procedures in place that are meant to keep the person safe from those kinds of events.
Dr. Prom-Wormley, how does the side effects compare with the side effects from just the flu shot?
That's a great question, and I would say it depends on the person. I've heard, the gamut, and I think a lot of it has to do with one's own biology. So, I think some people will say they've had like severe reactions to the flu shot. And really, headache, flu, like actually like some fever, but not as long as for the flu. And so that's why they've been nervous to take the COVID-19 vaccines, specifically the mRNA vaccines. And so I'd say it just depends. I don't have like a strong response in the terms of like, oh yes, if you had a bad experience with flu, you'll definitely have a bad experience with COVID-19. Yeah, it's not a one-to-one.
Right,
It's
right.
it's not consistent yet.
Thank you.
But with that in mind, if you are considering taking the vaccine and you are worried about side effects because you've had previous side effects with respect to the flu, this is a great opportunity to speak with your primary care provider and talk to them about, your concerns. And they may even guide you to potentially the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. And we're going to talk about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and show you how they differ. And it may be a solution for some people who have like a really sensitive to certain vaccines. But the reality is right now, whatever we get as a nation or as a state in terms of vaccines, we don't get to pick and choose.
Yeah.
We just don't have enough, product or vaccines out in the world for us to be able to pick and choose. And so you may want the Johnson & Johnson, but you get what you get at this point. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So I think this kind of came up. So have mRNA vaccines been found unsafe in the past? Well, I would say that any vaccine or any drug or, you've seen adverse effects. It's never a situation where there's no adverse effects. That's not realistic. As you can see when you watch the television and they kind of give you the next ad for this drug or that drug. So there's not a such thing as no side effects when it comes to a drug. But I would say that over the years, since the beginning of the development of the mRNA vaccines, which actually was as early as 1989, the technology was being developed at that time to do this kind of work. Those adverse effects have been identified and kind of addressed over time. So at this point, there's a very low chance of death, even though they have been publicized. I acknowledge that the news does a very good job of sharing when somebody dies from a COVID-19 vaccine. Um, I would say another area that is kind of unknown or still under investigation is the use of the polyethylene glycol that I mentioned. It appears as though that particular substance may be associated with some of these anaphylactic reactions. Um, and and so there are studies right now trying to understand whether or not that may be causing those anaphylactic events for some of those folks that are taking the vaccine. Um, it's again, it doesn't seem like a ton of people, but it's a reasonable concern to have, especially if you're prone to anaphylactic reactions. So that's where they feel like that's coming from, and that's probably the biggest area of concern for adverse reactions at this point.
So why, if they started to use the mRNA vaccines as long ago as 1989, why has it taken so long to actually develop a usable vaccine?
Yeah. So, okay. The thing is, like we said, like mRNA is really fragile.
Yeah.
And so they had to figure out, they had the idea of like, okay, um, they were trying to do it for AIDS. Part of this whole thing was to try to address AIDS a little and cancers as well. And they thought if they could use the mRNA and insert it into cells, that may be a way to address these illnesses. But because mRNA is so fragile, they couldn't figure out a way to get it into the body without it degrading. And so it took years and years of figuring out what kind of materials they could put around the mRNA so that it actually could get into the body, stay in the body, and actually be used by the cell's machinery before the body itself, its own immune system, would come and attack it. And so that was the holdup, was trying to figure out that piece. And then once you had a method for getting it into the body, you have to test it. So we had to do animal models, lots of animal models, to make sure that this technology would actually be safe. So, and then they use the animal models also for dosing, try to figure out what is the appropriate dosage that will be safe and effective in the animals. Once you move from an animal stage of testing, then you go into humans. And so you do your testing in humans. So even though we had an emergency use agreement in place, and that's considered phase 3, all that phase 1,
Yeah.
phase 2, that was all like ahead of time and even before COVID.
See, I don't think people realize that. I think people think that they just came up with this almost overnight, when in reality, this has been worked on for many, many years.
Yeah, it's true. I think that's some of the cases, like, man, we don't slap this stuff together. It's, we really, there's a lot of intentionality. I'm gonna tell you like how we got to doing this so fast. And I've got a slide on this in a second. So,
Okay.
but yeah, this was a long time coming, and we had it, we got a lucky break, well, quote unquote lucky, if you see it that way. So do you remember a couple years ago, we had SARS that was happening like in the Middle East, and MERS also was happening in the Middle East? Well, SARS, MERS, these are all in the same family as our SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID. And so they had an opportunity to do a little test run with some of that technology when we had the SARS outbreak and the MERS outbreak back in the day. So that's part of the reason why we kind of were able to test it a little bit in that situation there. And then they moved forward beyond that point. So we got to, I mean, I hate saying that, like somebody else's epidemic was our pandemic's, good grace, whatever, silver lining, but it's true. It's an iterative process. Um, we've already talked about allergic reactions, so I think I can move on off of that. Um, Now, um, how many mRNA vaccines are currently available in the United States? 3. There are 3 that are currently available: Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer, that are available through the emergency use agreement. AstraZeneca is making a play. They are submitting data. You may have even heard in the news this morning that there's some back and forth about the quality of the data with AstraZeneca at this time. So that is a conversation that is still happening. So it could potentially be 4. Nevertheless, there at the beginning of all this COVID-19 about a year ago, actually in January, there were 50 different COVID-19 vaccines that were being developed. I think at this point, probably 10 have come off the running. And so we're now at about 40 that are still either, in emergency use agreement or still under development. Because they still want to do other ways of developing this drug, like, to nasally and not through injection and whatnot. So this came up. So the mRNAs produced so quickly, can they be trusted? And it's happened so quick. And they slapped this together. Yeah, I think you can trust them, but I get why people are really concerned. So we try not to oversell. Scientists are we're really bad at selling, well, or good. I don't know. We just try to use the data to tell you a story, right? So we're not going to try to oversell it to you. We're not trying, we just want to do the right thing by you. So a lot of times you'll hear us say things like, it depends, or the proportion of this or that, or the data say this. And that is not helpful when people want to make decisions right now. You want to know, like, I am 90% positive that this is going to happen. Like, and sometimes we can't give you those answers. Sorry. This is definitely one of those times where we're trying to be cautious and we're trying to be reasonable. The short answer is, can you trust this? Strong lean to yes. But I think we need to really be honest about, like, what do you mean that these things were produced so quickly? And quickly is relative. As you saw, we started producing this technology in 1989. And that was really even before the Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project, if y'all remember, got started around 1997. And so our ability to even sequence DNA didn't get started until around 97. You are correct, David. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine was not based on mRNA, is DNA, and I will talk about that in a sec. But the concept's still the same. On both the mRNA and the Johnson & Johnson that's DNA focused, you still need a genetic sequence. The reason why we are able to move so fast right now is because we had a genetic sequence to work with. And that is in part thanks to the Zhang lab that was working in China around the first Wuhan case. They thought that it might be worth getting some samples from some of those cases that were coming around and sequencing those samples. And once they managed to sequence the samples, they noticed some things about this, the sequence, that they realized, oh, this is a coronavirus. Oh, this might be kind of related to some previously sequenced versions of SARS. And what they did, and what we do as like genetic scientists, is that we have large consortia around the world. And we are able to move really quickly with one another because we have a high degree of openness about sharing information. So what the Zhang lab did was that they uploaded the sequence into a server to all of the other researchers that were working in this area, and all of them were able to take the sequence and start studying it. Within 2 weeks of the Zhang lab having uploaded the sequence, there were already sequences and vaccines ready to start testing, to put on the market. So it's because we are able to use DNA technology And because it's related to mRNA is the reason why we can move so fast. Compare that against the typical technologies. The typical technologies for vaccines have previously been use a dead virus and take that dead virus and insert, inject it into a person, or take a live virus that's very weak and inject it into a person and allow the immune system to train up against one of those. In either situation, you've got to have a virus in place. You've got to grow up that virus. You've got to then, make a weaker version or kill it off and then test it out. That's a slower way of doing things. So part of the reason why we could move so fast is because we're using genetic technology. I think this was a real win for the field. And that's why, that's also why it feels crazy. I think it feels weird for folks. So I think we just have to acknowledge that. But it was not just out of nowhere. This was a long time coming, and it was a long time coming on how people share information with each other too. I don't think people were always, so keen to sharing data with each other back in the day, and so now they are. Questions? Okay. We've gone into this now. I feel like you can trust them. And I think we also have to acknowledge on how vaccines were previously generated, and most drugs, right? The general pipeline for drug development takes about 17 years on average. And the FDA kind of did the math, and we're like, okay, with so many people dying from SARS-CoV-2 so quickly, we have to kind of do some math here. Are we willing to wait 17 years and potentially, many, many more deaths? Or are we, have we done enough of our steps to say, we think we understand how this thing works, this vaccine works, and try it out in a population. And so they decided that the risks were outweighed by the benefits. And that is the heart of when the FDA makes an emergency use agreement. Do the benefits outweigh the risks? And if the answer is yes, then the emergency use agreement is issued. And that's what they said there. And so to the question of what about long-term data, long-term effects of the vaccine? The reality is that we don't have the long-term data because this was a rapidly developed vaccine. And so we will need to keep an eye out for those long-term data as they become available. And, it's an understandable feeling why somebody might feel like I'm not ready to make that leap yet. I want to see more data, or I want to see more people take it and see what happens. You go first, basically. So I get it. I definitely get it. Any other questions? All right. Now, why should you trust this particular vaccine after extremely short developmental period? I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm not asking you to blindly go into this with me. But I think that after having kind of done the research and understanding what the technology looks like, that I personally feel comfortable with the technology for the mRNA vaccines, and we'll talk about the Johnson & Johnson in a second, that I think it would work appropriately. Nevertheless, if you need to wait to see more data, that's understandable. And so we've talked about other pharmaceutical companies working on a more safer, effective vaccine. And yeah, there are some other vaccines. So some people are trying to do intranasal. I think somebody's trying to do a pill form of the vaccine. There are lots of different vaccines that are still being developed, and to try to get it to be easier to use, less freezer space, for example. So we're all waiting to see how they work. One of these other vaccine technologies is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Okay, so how does it work? The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a little bit different from the mRNA vaccines. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine takes an adenovirus, and it uses the adenovirus and inserts a DNA sequence of SARS-CoV-2. And so instead of encapsulating the genetic material, the genetic information in a lipid bubble like we did for the mRNA vaccines, we're just putting it inside of a virus. And so then when the body kind of recognizes the adenovirus as foreign, then it will begin to generate an immune response. But before it can, identify it as foreign, a couple of things need to happen. So the adenovirus is injected into you, and then it meets up with a cell, muscle cell, and that muscle cell will engulf the adenovirus. And then that, and that's what you see in the figure number, like the number 2 here. And then that adenovirus inserts its DNA material into our cell's nucleus. And then that DNA material is translated to mRNA. And then that mRNA, if you come on over to the right-hand side, is translated into translated RNA, and that becomes the spike protein. Your own cell's machinery makes up the spike protein. And then once you have all these spike proteins that have been generated by your own cell, they get migrated out to the outside of your cell, and then those get pushed out into your system. Once you've got these spike proteins hanging out, now your body, just like before, recognizes that something is foreign and I need to fight it, and and then it does the exact same things. It elicits the antigen protein cells to come and tag it. The T cells come in, do a rapid kill, and then the B cells come in, do antibodies. Same process. All of that is the same. It's just the way that it gets inserted and brought into the cell. That's the piece that's different. The other thing is because you can use DNA, it makes the Johnson & Johnson vaccine a lot nicer, because you don't have to freeze it and have these really cold temperatures, because DNA is far more robust against, in the environment compared to mRNA. So that's the major difference there between the two. Questions?
Yes, I have a question. So how can the Johnson & Johnson get away with 1 shot and the others need 2 shots?
Yeah, so part of the thing is that because the mRNA vaccines are a little bit newer, they really weren't sure how much to go after. So they ended up doing kind of 2 weaker shots just to make sure that they didn't overstimulate the body. They weren't, so they were trying to do it as a safety precaution so that the body could manage the mRNA vaccines. And I think eventually what you're going to see is there's going to be another generation of these mRNA vaccines where they'll get the dosage right, and you'll probably only need 1. But because, again, this was such a new version, they wanted to do it, to kind of introduce it slow and do it as 2, so that your body would have a chance to kind of adjust accordingly. Because the amount in the Moderna and the amount in the Pfizer are a little bit different. And so, and you're seeing differences in the way people respond. So that's really the bigger thing. Did that help?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Which previous vaccines have been developed based on the approach of technology? You mean like the mRNA vaccine? David?
I'm sorry, I was trying to unmute. I'm sorry, I didn't word that very well. Based on the Johnson & Johnson approach and technology, which
of the previous ones? I'm trying to think. I'd have to get back to you. I don't want to overstate it. So I'd have to get back to you. for the DNA, but this is not weird to introduce things via another virus. That's a common, but that's a relatively new but common way of doing business.
Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you for the questions too. I appreciate it. All right. So this is the part of the story where I stopped talking about the vaccines. Wait, hold on. Did I answer all your questions? I got what's an mRNA vaccine. I got long-term. Don't worry, I'm coming to the variants. Differences in the type of vaccine. Amy, did I answer your question? Oh, Amy's.
I'm not sure if did I ask one? I don't know. I don't think I did.
Yeah, you asked, you know.
Oh, that question, the difference in the vaccines at the very beginning. Okay, I thought you meant, did I just ask a question?
No.
Yeah. Yes, you did. Yes.
Okay. Do you have a follow-up or anything?
No, I don't think so. It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of difference other than maybe the Johnson is a different type, but I still don't really understand the Johnson vaccine, but I mean, I guess, you know, people will choose based on probably more the ability to get one shot versus two over the actual vaccine.
Yeah, so I guess the question, like the part where you're a little confused still is kind of like how they, I guess, how they work differently.
Right, yeah.
The
makeup of it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like the sequence itself, not that different. They're both using the same area of sequence to generate the protein, the spike protein. That's the same. The only real difference is how you are getting the sequence, the DNA or mRNA sequence into the body. That's the major difference. One's by mRNA, one's by DNA. The mRNA one is using this fat lipid and the DNA one's using a virus. That's it. But the concept is pretty much the same.
Yeah. And how about the efficacy of those three vaccines?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what's been presented by the companies. So for each of the emergency use agreements first, and then I'm going to give you the caveats. For the emergency use agreements for Pfizer and Moderna, you guys have heard probably on the news, oh, they're considered 95 and 94% effective, right? And so what that means is the group of people that got the vaccine, how many of those people got sick? Compare that against the group of people who didn't get the vaccine. How many of those people got sick and got COVID? That comparison is what they call the proportion, the efficacy, the percentage of efficacy. And so 94 and 95% for Pfizer and Moderna. Their sample sizes were in the area of about like 43,000 and about, you know, between 40 and 50,000 per study. Now we have the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. They've been able to be out a little bit longer. They had more time to do research. So they have upwards of over 1 million participants. And so they have more information there. And when they submitted their emergency use agreement, their efficacy rate was about 72%. And so then that got some people thinking, oh, Johnson & Johnson's no good. I mean, look at 94% and 72%. And so much so that the Detroit mayor was like, don't give me that Johnson & Johnson. It's not good enough. I want the good stuff. And the reality is, it's just a function of data. The available data is a lot more. You've got a lot less variability, and that's where you're at. I have a sneaking suspicion had Moderna and Pfizer had the opportunity to do their work for longer, they probably would have had similar results as well. So, you know, it's all relative. I think you just have to take it with that in mind. They're both quite effective, and honestly, they're still better than the flu vaccine, which is at about 50%. Other questions? Oh yeah, let me make sure I got all the other. We got the regulated. Oh, Aaron asked, how soon can you get the vaccine after you've had COVID? Okay, so currently it seems like you can get it after, if you've had COVID, you can go about 2 weeks after your quarantine period, and you can get it if it's available to you. You don't have to wait like a long period of time. Some people may want to wait because they feel like, oh, I've got the antibodies from being sick, so I'll just, I'll hold out. But if your time is up, like they're giving you the opportunity to take the vaccine, CDC doesn't seem to be stopping you to say, don't, wait for longer. You can take the vaccine after your 2-week period of illness. And then there was a similar question for if you had another vaccine, how long will it, how long should you wait before you take the COVID vaccine? On this, I don't know the answer. I would have to look up a little bit more and see what the current recommendation is. Just on kind of like, thinking about being kind to your body and your body's immune system, I wouldn't necessarily do them back-to-back days. Just to give yourself a little bit of a break. But what that time frame is, I'd have to look it up and give you more information.
So Hope has a question. She said that she read that fewer people had side effects after the J&J vaccine than the other two. Is that true?
There seems to be fewer side effects, yes, compared to the for Johnson & Johnson compared to Moderna and Pfizer. They don't seem to be quite as intense. So yeah, that so far that tracks correctly.
Okay.
I think I got all of them.
Wow, terrific. Now, one just kind of macro level question.
Yeah.
I mean, what is the public health argument or rationale for why people should get the COVID-19 vaccine?
Okay. I think there's a couple of reasons. These guys are the biggest reason. This variant's got me freaked out, if I'm honest. Oh, thanks, Nettie. The variants do have me worried. When this thing started, my team and I, we were looking at some of the websites. Well, there's a lovely website. Like I said, scientists, I don't know, we got down. When COVID-19 happened, it was like we got a buzz. And so they had already like started this amazing website looking at all the variants that were occurring in all the new cases of COVID-19 around the world. And they were able to kind of trace these different variants to different parts of the world. So like there was like the Chinese version that first came to the US, you started seeing it in Seattle is, when you started seeing those cases, and the genetic sequence for that one was very much matched on to what you saw in China. The ones that you saw on the East Coast tend to match up better with the versions that were coming from Europe. And so that we were able to even see that and kind of be able to monitor that in real time was amazing. But what you could also see when you were looking at those figures is that virus mutates. It mutates fast. It mutates a lot. And I mean, it's a virus. The virus is very simple. Like it wants to survive, right? I'm sympathizing with the virus. I'm giving human emotion to a stupid virus. But anyways, the virus just wants to survive, and it wants to live, and it wants to be out in the world. I am not asking you to have compassion for COVID-19, but you have to understand how it thinks. It wants to live, and it will do so by any means necessary. And it will do so by mutating. And what I've shown you here is a figure of, in the center of this left-hand figure, is just a picture of SARS-CoV-2 virus. And you guys have kind of seen this now over time with the spike proteins and all this. And this squiggly stuff in the center is meant to represent the genetic sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And what this picture on the outside of the virus is meant to do is to be a representation of the genetic sequence of this entire SARS-CoV-2 virus and just different parts of the virus. This red part of the virus, this red part of the code is representing the part of the code that makes the spike protein. And my little green circle moved, but this little, dang it, sorry, doesn't matter. This little green circle was supposed to go to this little red dot, one little red dot. And what we have seen is that one little red dot, a change in that one little red dot causes a change in the spike protein right here at the top. This little sequence change causes protein change here at the top. And this is just a top view of the same thing, of the spike protein. That's one mutation. This B117 variant, this is the one that is typically called the UK variant. It consists of 17 mutations, okay? I'm just focusing on one mutation right now. This one little mutation makes one little change in the spike protein. That's what it looks like normally. No change in the spike protein. This one teeny little change causes the spike protein to clutch onto the receptors, the cell receptors in your body, and hang on really tight. So previously, it might clutch onto your cell, and if something else came by, it might get knocked off. But now that the mutation has happened, it holds on tighter, and it can stay on tighter until it gets absorbed by the cell. So it becomes kind of, in a way, more infectious because it can hold on into your system. It doesn't get pushed out faster by your own immune system. And so this is just one of the mutations. Like I said, there are 17 different mutations that are related to this UK variant, and each one of them is making some sort of change either in the spike protein or other different areas of the protein of the virus, so that it can be more nimble against your own defenses. So the more that we allow the virus to replicate,
Right.
the more we allow the virus to have opportunity to mutate, because all the virus wants to do is live. It just wants to be out in the world, and it's going to be out in the world by changing itself up. I mean, it's no different from a play on first down versus second down versus third. You're not going to run the same play, first down, third down, fourth down. You're gonna change your plays. That's what the virus does. And so this has got me worried. And I know, some people are like, oh, you're worried for nothing. You're just being overly concerned, blah, blah, blah. But because this thing can move so fast, and it makes a mutation every time it replicates, it's just a lottery. It's just a matter of time when the right mutation will happen and will, put us more at risk for it to be, more easily spread, or have a more severe effect potentially in our own bodies. So this is why I think it's important to consider taking the vaccines, because COVID ain't stopping. It ain't going nowhere. Do I think the variants will lead to another surge? Maybe. I mean, if you look at the experience that's happening in Europe, they're already in a third wave. They're going through lockdown in the UK, Italy, France. They are in active lockdown right now. And so, and if we kind of think about how the trends have been going, Europe always happened before us. And then we followed suit because it hit us next. So yeah, it's possible as certainly as possible. And guess what? It's getting warm. Everybody wants to be with each other, and barbecues are coming. You know, it's getting to, and we're all tired of being inside, and we're tired of not being with each other. And we just want some, you know, we want people time. So our own behaviors are going to put us at risk for, you know, for transmitting the virus.
Yeah.
And so for me, that's a real reason to consider doing that, you know, to taking the vaccine. And remembering, say again?
Actually, thank you for a great presentation. I want to say to you and the group, hope I'm not coming across as anti-vaccine. The point here is to learn about it. But what I am just slightly confused about, earlier you said these vaccines aren't like we've got this bubble of protection around us.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't understand why taking the vaccine actually is going to deter the variants, because the vaccine still lives.
That's right. That's right. That's such a great question. Thank you for asking it. So you're absolutely right that it's not going to like, you know, put a bubble around you, but if you come in contact with the virus, what it's done is it primes your system to fight the virus as quickly as possible so that you don't get as severely ill as you potentially could have been had you allowed the virus to stay in your body and fester more, because your own immune system has to figure it out. So it's kind of like, I think about the vaccines like when you're training, like if you do weightlifting or any kind of other physical activity training, like the more and more you do of that physical activity training, the more your body can adapt to different changes when you change your workout routine out. And so what you're doing is you're kind of training your immune system to be aware of this foreign body. And, you know, in the form of this, you know, this kind of spike protein piece, because that is common across all of the variants. The spike doesn't change. It just might be a little tweak here or a little tweak there, but the general pieces, large scale of the protein are still in place. So it just gives your body that information to be trained up to fight against an infection should you get infected, should you come in contact with the virus.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And no, you're very nice. If you knew how mean scientists are to each other, because we're always trying to get it right, I'm like, this is great. You're very nice. Keep asking questions. So yeah, and so I've only just talked about, I only gave you information about one mutation in one location for one variant, which was the UK variant. But remember, we got two other variants that are quite popular, that are getting a lot of play in the world, and that's the South African variant and the Brazilian variant. It's not fair to call them like and think like, oh, because somebody travels from those locations, they're going to bring them over to the United States. That's not fair. It's just that we could, you know, like we could get a whole new version here in the United States, and they may call it the US variant because there are new places where you might get mutations. But this is where these mutations have been identified first. And so who knows what we'll bring to the table as, you know, as the US. Because I believe we are unique, and we will bring some flavor to the table. So, do any of the vaccines offered today only attack the current variant or all? Okay, so keep your eye on this space, Amy. Currently, the understanding is that all the vaccines are covering all the variants for now. They are actively researching this right now, but it looks promising. It looks like we're going to be okay for now. But again, the more we can slow down the spread and potential mutation opportunities, the more we can rely on that. So, you know, keep your eye on the space is the best thing I can say. But the initial results look promising. And then the next question, well, it was a question, but it kind of came up for you guys, is how do we talk to people about this stuff, and how do we do it in a way that's respectful? I know it's kind of small, so I'm happy to share with you this file if you think it's helpful. We've been experiencing these issues in Richmond as well. The East End of Richmond is a predominantly African-American community. We have 4 public housing communities that we work with. And, the mistrust is real, and as a scientist who could be perceived as a white scientist, I'm not necessarily always welcome, talking my scientific mumbo jumbo. So I need to think carefully about how I'm presenting information in a way that's in partnership with my colleagues that are working with the community, and really understand what's going on. So when we did the COVID-19 needs assessment survey, we talked about opinions. And then what we did afterwards was to look at those results with our community partners in the room. And we talked about, like, what do you think this means? How do you interpret these results? And how could we be supportive in this space? Because we started seeing it with the tests. Even before the vaccines came on the scene, those COVID-19 tests, woo, they brought up some excitement. One of the common comments was, oh, that COVID-19 test is going to give me COVID. So I want to take that test because it's going to give me COVID. And how come y'all are coming to public housing to give us these tests? Are you trying to give us COVID or what? And so the Richmond City Health District was trying to be responsive to the issue of higher rates of COVID-19 in the African American community, but inadvertently had sent another message of, like, of how, what are you doing to us? And so, it really sent home a message like, you tread carefully here.
Yeah.
And be respectful. So what we've done in this space is this particular flyer is probably the first related to our COVID-19 vaccines. And we started really kind of light. And we said, COVID-19 vaccines are part of your COVID-19 toolkit. Your COVID-19 toolkit doesn't change. You still are going to wear masks. You're still going to keep distance, and you're still going to wash your hands. That's all changed. You just got to upgrade by including the vaccines in your toolkit. But nothing else is changing here, because you still want to reduce the possibility of transmitting through the air and what have you. And so what we feel like we did, I don't know if it's true because I haven't actually come back and done any additional analyses on this approach, was we tried to say you have options, and the vaccines aren't the end all be all. You are not saved by taking the vaccines. They're just another tool in your toolkit.
Great.
The other thing that we've talked a lot about in our space is how to talk about the vaccines. I can tell you, even though, I mean, Ph.D. scientist, blah, 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 you're not going to win in a discussion when you're trying to talk about numbers, because as we've already discussed, the numbers are still being generated. People are still doing research. And so it's still, this is still an active area of study. So don't go there. At least that's my suggestion. What helps is to understand where people are and meet them where they are. And so I typically like to just listen to where people are with their processing of the information of vaccines first, and understand where their hesitancy lies. So we recently had a talk with some of our members in our African American community who are thinking about the vaccine, and we're a little bit on the fence. And one of the things that came up is, like, I have health conditions right now, and if COVID, the disease, is supposed to be worse because I have other health conditions, should I be worried about taking the vaccine? Because maybe it's going to be, be even worse. Like, I'm going to get worse side effects because I have these current health conditions. And so it's probably when you want to talk about with your primary care provider first. The other thing is, it's fear. It's a straight up fear. And I can understand where this is coming from. If you hear the news and the news is saying, like, oh, this person died from COVID, or not COVID, but the vaccine. Oh, we had one person die from the vaccine, or we had this issue with the vaccine, adverse reaction from the vaccine. If that's what you hear, you're going to be scared because you're basically doing the equivalent. You potentially are putting yourself like at risk by just self-injecting death. That's, somebody could conceptualize it that way. And so, that's a real legitimate fear that you kind of have to work through with folks and talk that through. And so, yeah, we do talk about it. And then there is the question, well, if the variants are coming, why bother taking the vaccine? Because some people are really familiar with the flu situation. Every time every year you get a new flu vaccine, you have to change things around. So is it going to be the same for COVID? And like I said, right now, it doesn't seem like that. It's early days, but things seem positive with the current 3 vaccines, that they do seem to be robust against the variants. There are religious concerns. And I think, there have been discussions about how the vaccines were developed in the first place. That, were their cells used from aborted fetuses? And if that's the case, then, should I ethically be taking the vaccines? And I would say it's not as bad as you think when it comes to the use of aborted fetuses and the stem cells piece. There's not much going on in Moderna and Pfizer. There was some talk that it has been happening in Johnson & Johnson. That's a whole nother long conversation that we probably need to have offline, because it is a subject, for some people of like legitimate concern. I will say the Catholic Church at least the Catholic Church has said that they feel that taking the vaccine is kind of an act of mercy and charity. And so they are condoning the use of vaccines, despite the fact that, there have been, use of fetal tissue in the past. I will also couch this with most of your health research, your drugs, have some sort of, underbelly. There's an underbelly there. And either you've marginalized populations of color, you've marginalized some group of people along the way. And so there is an underbelly there to the development of scientific research that, again, we can talk about. I'm happy to talk that through, but it is not perfect. It is not perfect if you're looking from an ethical perspective. So yeah, you got to talk that through. And so I think the best way that I've had conversations, I found my most fruitful conversations about talking about the vaccines has to just been like, just be honest and share what I know and what I don't know, and share stories. So when I can, if a person is interested in learning more information, I share as many trusted sources as I can, information sources as I can. I have in these slides tried very hard to include references whenever possible. So I'm happy to share these slides with you so that you can review those resources for yourself and determine whether or not they would be helpful. And also VDH does have a COVID-19 vaccine hotline just to get information. It's not to sign up for the vaccine. It's not just, if you have questions, you can call this hotline and they will answer the questions. I have called it just to make sure it's like legit, and somebody would actually answer the phone, and they do answer the phone, and they do answer in multiple languages. So if you have someone who speaks another language other than English, they can answer your questions. And then, it's being honest about your own stories. If I'm honest, right, I wasn't like all in on the vaccines from day one. I had to like sit down and kind of understand how everything was working and kind of convince myself that the data were reasonable, that I trusted them. And before I made a decision, and my husband and I can't even tell you how many conversations we had. We had like whole journal clubs over weekends. That's what we do when in the House of Nerds. So, you know, we would spend weekends poring over research and data and arguing back and forth about this or that, to see where we were. So I can understand where, you know, somebody's still processing, because there's a lot of information and it's changing very rapidly. But in the end, I thought the data were good. And so I decided to take the vaccine. And after having those conversations, if someone's still not ready, cool. You can just let them know that you'll be there if they have other questions, no judgment.
Yeah.
And that's it. So I hope that was helpful.
Oh my God, are you kidding? That was awesome. We are so lucky that you gave us this time and you made it so clear and you broke it down so easy for us to understand. And wow, it's an exciting time to be an epidemiologist, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably one of, like, at least for me, one of the few times where I get to be a genetic epidemiologist and an epidemiologist and community engaged researcher and like pull them all together and it all have purpose. So it's very gratifying.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And I do want, if you're willing to share your presentation, definitely would like to include that on our website.
Sure.
And again, just thank you so much. You're just awesome.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Anything else for the good of the order? Any other burning questions?
Well, if I might, and I know we're short on time, but as places reopen, is there anything in addition to what we've already been doing that we should definitely do, or some things that we shouldn't worry about anymore, just as we look ahead in the coming months?
Yeah, I think definitely keep using your mask and washing your hands. If you do nothing else, keep using your mask and wash your hands. If you can keep your distance, great. But I know, like, I even do it. Like, I like people. I really like being close to people. So my husband has to be like, hey, back up. You're not in your 6 feet, back up. I'm like, ah. So, you know, and that can be challenging. Outdoors obviously is better than indoors whenever possible. So to the extent that you can have events, maybe you're having, like, you know, events to sign people up for programs. They can be outdoors with distance, with masks, with, you know, all of those things. You can do that. Just, you know, very consistent. That's the other thing. Be consistent. If you're going to commit to masks, do it every single time. It's kind of like, this is what I tell everybody. It's like safe sex, right? You don't use a condom every, like, once in a blue moon. You use the condom every single time. You use the mask every single time. So, yeah.
Okay. On that note, all right. Thank you so much again, and take care, be safe, and you're just great.
So,
Have a good one.
you too.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.